Caleb Johnson thought Maple Street was his fresh start. Each night in Chicago, his piano gathered crowds moved by melody, not noise. Across the street, a struggling magician named Ethan watched, envy growing as applause passed him by. One complaint turned music into a courtroom battle. Caleb stood accused of causing disorder, but the truth was different. A video revealed community, not chaos. In the end, talent spoke louder than prejudice. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. A cool autumn wind drifted between the red brick buildings of downtown Chicago, carrying the scent of roasted nuts from a nearby cart and the faint metallic hum of the subway below. The sky glowed amber as the sun dipped behind glass towers, and Maple Street began its nightly transformation. For a few short blocks, the ordinary city felt like a living gallery. Painters leaned their canvases against brick walls. A pair of college dancers practiced slow turns beneath the streetlights. Street musicians tuned guitars, tapped drum rims, cleared their throats. The pavement seemed to hold stories from decades past, and tonight it would hold new ones. At the center of it all stood Caleb Johnson. Caleb was 34 years old, tall and lean with deep brown skin and a quiet steadiness in his posture. His shoulders were relaxed but grounded, the posture of someone who had carried responsibility early in life. His hands were long-fingered and strong, shaped by years of scales and repetition. A faint scar crossed his left knuckle from when he once moved an old piano by himself down a narrow apartment staircase. Too proud to ask for help at 22, his eyes were calm, observant, almost meditative. They were the kind of eyes that listened before speaking. His upright piano, painted midnight blue with hand-brushed golden swirls, rested beside the subway entrance. The paint was chipped in places but polished carefully. Caleb had bought it second-hand and restored it over months in his garage. The instrument had become an extension of him. When he sat down and pressed the first chord, Maple Street shifted. Notes flowed warm and unhurried, blending jazz phrasing with gospel undertones and classical discipline. Caleb didn't perform for spectacle. He played for connection. His melodies rose gently, then folded back into themselves like stories told at the dinner table. Tourists slowed. Office workers paused mid-step. A child tugged her mother's sleeve. Phones lifted, not aggressively but in admiration. Laughter softened into listening. Across the street stood Ethan Miller. Ethan was 31, average height with a slim build and pale skin that flushed easily in the cold. His brown hair was neatly styled, though wind often pushed it out of place. He wore a fitted black vest over a white button-down shirt rolled at the sleeves, part stage persona, part daily armor. His movements were precise, almost rehearsed, even off stage. He had sharp features and alert gray eyes that darted constantly, measuring reactions, calculating angles. Ethan prided himself on control. Magic, to him, was about directing attention exactly where he wanted it. He performed clean, simple card flourishes. Coins appeared behind ears. Silk scarves vanished and reappeared in coat pockets. Technically, his work was solid, but solid did not mean captivating. As Caleb's music swelled, people drifted naturally toward the piano. Ethan's audience thinned until only 2 teenagers remained, half interested, checking their phones between tricks. At first, Ethan told himself it was coincidence. Music always pulled crowds. It was temporary. But as weeks passed, Caleb's tip jar filled with folded bills and the bright ping of digital donation alerts. Ethan's jar collected spare change and sympathetic smiles. Ethan's jaw tightened as applause rolled across the street. Envy is quiet at first. It doesn't shout. It whispers comparisons. Caleb closed a piece with a gentle cascade of notes. Applause rippled warmly, echoing between brick towers. He smiled, small, sincere, and nodded in gratitude. He wasn't smiling because of money. He was thinking about Naomi. Naomi Johnson, his wife, was 32, tall and slender with warm brown skin and expressive dark eyes. Her hair, usually tied back in a low bun, framed a face that carried both strength and fatigue. She worked long evening shifts as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. Naomi had once dreamed of becoming a pediatric specialist, but when Lila was born prematurely 7 years ago, priorities shifted. She was steady, patient with others, and fiercely protective of her family. Years earlier, she had watched her own father lose his job after being unfairly blamed for a mistake at work. That moment carved caution into her personality. She believed in stability, in not drawing unnecessary attention. "Keep your head down and do your work well," she often told Caleb gently. At home, Lila Johnson waited. Lila was 7 years old, small for her age, with soft curls that framed her bright face. She had inherited Caleb's long fingers and Naomi's observant eyes. She wore oversized sweaters and carried books everywhere, even to the dinner table. She struggled with reading at first, embarrassed when classmates read faster. Caleb began turning bedtime into music and story sessions, blending rhythm with language. Gradually, Lila found confidence. Every night, she waited by the living room window, practicing sentences aloud until she heard her father's keys in the door. Caleb's music wasn't about fame. It was about rent due on the first. It was about groceries. It was about Lila's piano lessons at the community center. Back on Maple Street, another figure lingered near the crowd. Marcus Reed, 16, stood slightly behind the listeners. He was tall and thin, with short, tightly coiled hair and cautious eyes. He wore a second-hand saxophone case slung over his shoulder. Marcus had discovered jazz in his school band program and practiced alone on rooftops to avoid disturbing neighbors. His father worked double shifts driving delivery trucks. His mother cleaned office buildings overnight. Music was Marcus's escape from noise. Caleb had noticed him weeks earlier. "Bring it tomorrow," Caleb had said once, nodding at the case. "Let's see what you've got." Encouragement had changed Marcus's posture. He now stood straighter when Caleb played, studying finger movements, absorbing phrasing. On this particular evening, the crowd grew denser than usual. A group of tourists from out of state clustered near the piano trying to capture the perfect video angle. A pair of office workers bumped shoulders, arguing lightly over space. "Watch it." "No, you watch it." The tension lasted only seconds, but Ethan saw it. His gray eyes sharpened. He pulled out his phone, not to record the melody, but the jostling crowd. He angled carefully, cropping Caleb from the frame as much as possible, focusing instead on congestion. A seed of an idea formed. Caleb continued playing unaware. The final piece of the evening was softer, almost reflective. The wind cooled. Streetlights flickered brighter. Maple Street felt held in a moment of shared quiet. When applause echoed down the block, Ethan stood in shadow, hands clenched at his sides. A passing pedestrian nearly knocked over his small folding table. "Sorry," the man muttered absent-mindedly, eyes still turned toward Caleb. Ethan's pride absorbed the slight like a bruise. Later that night, Caleb packed his piano cover carefully, counting tips not with excitement but calculation. Enough for the week's groceries. Enough to ease Naomi's worry for a few days. Across the street, Ethan emptied his jar into his coat pocket. The coins felt heavier than they were. The subway roared beneath the pavement as both men walked in opposite directions. Above them, brick towers stood silent witnesses. And somewhere between applause and silence, something inside Ethan Miller hardened. The wind shifted colder as October deepened, and Maple Street began to feel narrower at night. Caleb's audience had grown beyond the predictable circle of tourists and office workers. Now there were regulars, an elderly couple who brought folding chairs, a food delivery driver who timed his break around Caleb's second set, a group of college students who streamed his performances live every Friday evening. The brick towers no longer echoed casually, they carried expectation. Some nights, the sidewalk became so dense that pedestrians slowed to a shuffle. It was rarely aggressive, more a matter of bodies adjusting to limited space. But even small friction can spark tension. A woman in heels once snapped at a man holding his phone too high. Two teenagers argued over who had arrived first. Caleb, sensing the energy, would soften his tempo, lowering the music like a hand pressing gently on restless water. He did not see conflict as drama. He saw it as something to calm. Across the street, Ethan Miller watched with sharpened attention. The earlier envy had matured into calculation. He no longer simply observed. He analyzed. When the crowd thickened, he filmed. Not Caleb's hands, not the melody, but elbows bumping, raised voices, narrowed walkways. He adjusted angles deliberately, cropping out moments of peace. Noise without context is powerful when isolated. Ethan had always been meticulous. As a child in suburban Ohio, he had been the quiet boy who practiced sleight of hand alone in his bedroom mirror. His father, a traveling salesman with little patience for imagination, once told him, "Magic isn't a career, it's a hobby." Ethan spent years trying to prove otherwise. He moved to Chicago at 22 with a suitcase and a deck of cards, convinced he would rise through talent alone. His apartment now reflected stalled ambition. It was modest. Third floor, narrow windows, radiator clanking at night. The walls were covered with fading posters from small magic conventions he had attended in his 20s. Some corners of the posters curled inward, tape yellowing. A metal shelf held trophies from minor competitions. Third place, honorable mention. They collected dust. He lived alone, no pets, no photographs of family on display. His kitchen counter was cluttered with takeout containers and half-read instructional books titled Mastering Audience Control and the Psychology of Perception. Ethan liked control. What he hated was being invisible. Late at night, he reviewed his phone recordings. He trimmed clips carefully, reducing 3-minute scenes into 20-second bursts of congestion and raised voices. He uploaded nothing yet. He was gathering material. Back on Maple Street, Caleb's world was expanding in a different direction. Marcus Reed had begun arriving earlier each evening, his saxophone now polished to a shine. Marcus was tall and thin, his limbs still slightly awkward with youth. His hands trembled the first time Caleb invited him to play between sets. The boy's instrument was slightly dented near the bell. Second-hand, purchased through months of saving from part-time grocery work. "Don't chase perfection," Caleb told him gently. "Chase honesty." Marcus nodded, lips tight with concentration. When they played together for the first time, the sound was tentative but sincere. Caleb anchored the harmony while Marcus's notes wavered and then steadied. The small collaboration shifted something in the crowd. Applause felt different, less about spectacle, more about shared growth. In the audience one evening stood Professor Daniel Harper, a middle-aged black man with silver-framed glasses and a wool coat that hung loosely over a lean frame. He taught music theory at a local community college. His salt-and-pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his voice carried calm authority, shaped by decades of teaching students who doubted themselves. Years earlier, Daniel had nearly abandoned music after facing subtle barriers in academia. A mentor had once told him, "Sometimes you stay not because it's easy, but because someone else needs to see you stay." After Marcus's set, Daniel approached. "You've got raw phrasing," he said to the teenager. "Have you considered scholarship auditions?" Marcus blinked, surprised. "I didn't think I was ready." "No one feels ready," Daniel replied softly. Caleb watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. This was the real reward. Doors opening without force. Meanwhile, Naomi noticed changes at home. Caleb came back later now, exhausted but thoughtful. She was perceptive, reading shifts in posture the way some read headlines. One evening, she leaned against the kitchen counter, still in her scrubs, dark circles faint beneath her eyes. "The crowds are bigger," she said. Caleb nodded. It's good for tips. Naomi hesitated. Just be careful. Bigger crowds mean bigger attention. She spoke not from fear, but from memory. Years earlier, she had witnessed a colleague wrongly accused by a patient's family. The hospital investigation had dragged for months before clearing her name. Naomi had learned then how quickly perception could twist. I play music, Caleb said gently. I know, she answered, and I'm proud of you. Across the city, Ethan's recordings grew into a folder labeled Evidence. He studied local ordinances about public gathering permits. He bookmarked sections discussing pedestrian obstruction. The more he read, the more his frustration found justification. One brisk Thursday evening, rain began unexpectedly. It started as a mist and then sharpened into a steady drizzle that sent casual listeners scattering. Caleb continued playing beneath a small portable canopy, fingers steady despite the chill. A smaller but loyal crowd remained, umbrellas overlapping like petals. Two men argued again over space, voices raised just enough to be heard. Ethan stood at the edge, filming carefully. This time, he stepped closer. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to add commentary. You see, he muttered under his breath while recording. It's always like this. He angled his phone toward the subway entrance where foot traffic slowed to avoid the cluster of listeners. A woman in a red coat struggled briefly to pass through. The clip lasted 15 seconds. To Ethan, it felt definitive. At home, later that night, rain tapping against his window, he compiled the footage into a short montage. No music, no applause. Only fragments of congestion, raised voices, and blocked pathways. He replayed it several times, convincing himself of the narrative. Meanwhile, Marcus practiced harder than ever. Encouraged by Professor Harper's suggestion, he researched scholarship deadlines. His parents, tired but supportive, sat at the kitchen table listening as he attempted more complex improvisations. His father, broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, placed a large hand on Marcus's shoulder. You keep going, he said simply. On Maple Street, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Regular performers began noticing officials occasionally walking the block, uniformed but not intervening. One of them was Officer Linda Chavez, a Latina woman in her late 30s with an athletic build and sharp, observant eyes. She had grown up in Chicago's South Side and understood both community pride and bureaucratic scrutiny. She was fair but firm, known among vendors for being direct without hostility. One evening, she paused near Caleb's piano. Just keep your crowd mindful of the walkway, she said calmly. Caleb nodded respectfully. I will. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was preventative. Ethan watched from across the street, interpreting the exchange differently. To him, it confirmed vulnerability. By the end of the month, Maple Street felt charged, not dramatically but subtly, like air before a shift in weather. The applause still came. Marcus still improved. Naomi still reminded Caleb to stay grounded. But one rainy afternoon, as gray clouds hung low and the brick towers looked darker than usual, two city officials approached Caleb's piano before he even began setting up. The first was Harold Benson, a middle-aged white man with thinning blonde hair and a Navy City-issued jacket stretched slightly over his midsection. He carried a clipboard and wore an expression practiced into neutrality. Years in municipal compliance had taught him to avoid emotional involvement. Beside him stood Carla Nguyen, a petite Asian-American woman in her late 20s with sharp eyes and a structured posture. She was newer to the department, still holding on to idealism about fairness in civic systems. Mr. Johnson? Benson asked. Caleb straightened slowly. Yes, sir. Benson handed him a set of documents. A formal complaint has been filed regarding obstruction of public pathways and disturbance. The words landed heavier than the paper itself. Rain dotted the edges of the page. Marcus stood a few steps away, saxophone case in hand, confusion spreading across his young face. Caleb read silently. Across the street, Ethan Miller watched from beneath an awning, expression unreadable. The seed had been planted. The courtroom felt colder than Maple Street ever had. It wasn't the temperature alone, it was the silence. A silence sharpened by polished wood, by the American flag standing rigid in the corner, by the faint echo of shoes against marble floors. Outside, Chicago traffic roared in its usual rhythm. Inside, everything moved slower, heavier. Caleb Johnson sat at the defense table wearing a charcoal suit he reserved for church and parent-teacher meetings. The fabric fit neatly across his tall, lean frame, though his hands, usually so confident over piano keys, rested clasped together to keep them steady. His posture remained upright, shoulders squared not in defiance, but in dignity. Across the aisle sat Ethan Miller. Ethan wore a navy blazer over a pale blue shirt, collar stiff, jaw clean-shaven. His hair was styled carefully as if presentation itself were evidence. His gray eyes carried intensity, though beneath it flickered something restless. He sat slightly forward as if ready to spring at the slightest opportunity to speak. Behind Caleb, Naomi Johnson sat in the second row. She had tied her dark hair into a tighter bun than usual, a sign of tension. Her posture was straight but rigid, hands folded together so tightly her knuckles had paled. Years in nursing had taught her composure in crisis, but this felt different. In a hospital, facts ruled. Here, perception seemed louder. Beside her sat Marcus Reed. Marcus had traded his hoodie for a borrowed button-down shirt slightly too large at the collar. His long frame folded awkwardly into the bench. His usually alert eyes were lowered, staring at the polished floor as though the wood grain held answers. This was his first time inside a courtroom. The weight of it pressed against his youth. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Margaret Whitmore entered. Judge Whitmore was 61, tall and narrow-shouldered with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back into a precise bun. Her face carried sharp lines earned from decades in the legal system. She had built her career on discipline and distance. Born into a working-class family in Illinois, she had once watched her own father lose a small business over a technical violation. That memory had made her strict about rules, sometimes rigidly so. Her dark eyes surveyed the room with calm authority. "This hearing concerns a complaint regarding obstruction of public pathways and disturbance of order," she began, voice level and controlled. Ethan rose first. His voice started measured, but quickly gathered heat. "Your Honor, for months I have observed unsafe crowding caused by Mr. Johnson's performances. Pedestrians are blocked. Arguments break out. The sidewalk becomes impassable." He gestured subtly as if the air itself confirmed him. "This isn't about art," he added. "It's about safety." The courtroom absorbed his words. Caleb rose when prompted. "I play music," he said quietly. His voice was deep, steady, not theatrical, like many others on Maple Street. His restraint contrasted Ethan's urgency. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "Do you believe the space belongs to you, Mr. Johnson?" The question hung in the air longer than expected. Caleb paused before answering. "No, ma'am, it belongs to the city. I share it." Another question followed. "Are these gatherings intentional?" "I don't control who stops to listen," Caleb replied. "I don't invite crowds. I play." The exchange felt heavier than law. It felt layered. In the back row sat another observer, Professor Daniel Harper. He had come quietly, coat folded neatly across his lap. His steady presence reflected concern more than surprise. He had seen talented individuals scrutinized before, and he understood how quickly admiration could be reframed as disruption. Ethan's lawyer, a young attorney named Brian Keller, stood next. Brian was in his late 20s, thin-framed with sharp cheekbones and meticulously parted blonde hair. Fresh out of a respected law school, he carried ambition in his posture. His voice was clear, rehearsed. He presented video clips. Short, fragmented moments of crowd congestion appeared on the courtroom monitor. raised voices, people brushing shoulders. A narrow sidewalk filled tightly. No music played, no applause echoed, just tension without context. Naomi inhaled sharply. Marcus's hands clenched. Caleb watched the screen without speaking. Judge Whitmore remained expressionless. Public pathways must remain accessible, Brian concluded. The clerk of court, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Blake, typed steadily at her desk. Sandra had short auburn hair and kind eyes that softened when no one was looking. She had worked in the courthouse for 20 years. She had learned that neutrality did not always feel neutral. Judge Whitmore folded her hands. "Mr. Johnson," she said carefully, "while artistic expression is valued, it cannot override public order." The air shifted. "I am issuing a temporary suspension of your street performance permit pending further review. A fine will be assessed for obstruction violations." The words fell clean and final. Naomi's hands trembled visibly now. Marcus lowered his head further, shame and confusion mixing in silence. Across the aisle, Ethan exhaled slowly. It was not a smile exactly, but satisfaction tightened the corners of his mouth. Months of frustration felt vindicated. Caleb nodded once. "I understand," he said. His voice did not break. Outside the courthouse, wind swept across the steps, scattering dry leaves in restless spirals. The city moved on, unaware of how heavy a single decision could feel inside one family. Inside the courtroom, papers shuffled. The gavel struck lightly. The echo lingered longer than it should have. Ethan remained seated for a moment after adjournment, watching Caleb gather his documents. For a brief second, something uncertain flickered across Ethan's face. Doubt, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by composure. Professor Harper approached Marcus quietly. "This isn't the end," he whispered. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Naomi stood beside Caleb as they exited. She did not speak immediately. Her silence was protective, gathering strength before words. The courthouse doors closed behind them with a heavy thud. Inside, Judge Whitmore remained seated a moment longer than usual, reviewing the paperwork again. Her face revealed nothing. But the ruling had been made. Caleb's permit was suspended. A fine had been issued. And for now, Maple Street would grow quieter. The sound of the gavel had barely settled into silence when a chair shifted in the back row. "Your Honor," a clear voice called, steady but urgent. "May I speak?" Every head turned. A young woman stood slowly, clutching a tablet against her chest as though it were both shield and proof. "My name is Emily Carter," she said. "I'm a graduate student in media studies at Northwestern. I've been documenting urban street art in Chicago for my thesis." Emily Carter was 26, tall and slender with fair skin lightly freckled across her nose. Her auburn hair fell in loose waves to her shoulders, slightly unruly as if brushed back in haste. She wore a gray wool coat over a navy sweater, practical boots, and carried herself with quiet conviction. Her hazel eyes held the alertness of someone trained to observe before judging. 2 years earlier, Emily had witnessed a small local muralist accused falsely of vandalism after his art gained attention. She had recorded footage that eventually cleared his name. Since then, she had made it a habit to archive everything carefully. She believed stories deserved context. Judge Margaret Whitmore paused, fingers resting lightly on the bench. "On what grounds, Miss Carter?" "I have documented footage relevant to this complaint," Emily replied. Her voice did not waver. A brief exchange followed between attorneys. Brian Keller looked irritated, whispering sharply to Ethan. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. He had not anticipated interruption. After a measured silence, Judge Whitmore nodded. "Proceed." Emily stepped forward and connected her tablet to the courtroom monitor. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. The screen flickered. Music filled the room. Not noise, not congestion, but melody. Caleb's piano echoed gently against the courtroom walls, warm chords rising in contrast to the sterile air. The shift was immediate. Even the clerk, Sandra Blake, paused mid-keystroke. The video showed Maple Street bathed in golden light. Listeners stood calmly, some with eyes closed. A small child swayed near the front, smiling. Silence followed the clip. Then Emily swiped to another. This time the perspective widened. Multiple angles from different nights. Livestream screenshots with scrolling comments. This makes my day better. Peaceful energy. Wish every city had this. The timestamps stretched back months. Your Honor, Emily said carefully, public reaction is overwhelmingly positive. These gatherings are voluntary and peaceful. She tapped again. A short clip appeared, one Ethan had never seen from this angle. The crowd was steady, music flowing. Then, from the side of the frame, Ethan himself entered. His arms lifted abruptly. He gestured sharply at a pair of pedestrians. His voice, though faint, carried agitation. Another clip followed. Similar pattern. Music? Calm. Then raised motion near the edge. Ethan, waving, speaking heatedly to someone out of view. Ethan shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. I was concerned about safety, he muttered under his breath. Emily did not accuse. She presented. These incidents of tension appeared to originate from outside the music itself, she said evenly. The majority of the time, the atmosphere is orderly. Professor Daniel Harper, still seated quietly behind Marcus, folded his hands with subtle relief. Naomi felt something loosen in her chest for the first time that day. The courtroom air felt different now, not warmer, but clearer. Judge Whitmore leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing as she replayed one of the clips. Her expression did not soften, but it shifted from certainty to reconsideration. Brian Keller rose quickly. Selective footage can be misleading as well, Your Honor. Emily met his gaze calmly. That is why I have compiled recordings from multiple independent sources. She displayed a grid of live streams from different users, different angles, different dates. None appeared coordinated. All showed similar scenes: music, listening, applause. Public response matters, Emily continued. People gather because they are moved, not because they are incited. The words settled heavily. Ethan's confidence began to fracture. The narrative he had carefully assembled felt less stable when viewed beside a fuller picture. In the back row, Marcus lifted his head for the first time since the ruling. Judge Whitmore requested a brief recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, conversations murmuring in restrained tones. Ethan remained seated, staring at the blank monitor. His reflection looked smaller in the dark screen. Outside the courtroom doors, Naomi approached Emily. Thank you, she said softly, voice still trembling. Emily shook her head. I'm not taking sides, I'm showing context. Caleb stepped forward next. His gratitude was quiet but genuine. You didn't have to do that. I document stories, Emily replied. And this one wasn't complete. Across the hallway, Ethan stood alone near a tall window overlooking the gray Chicago skyline. Rain had begun again, streaking faint lines down the glass. For the first time, doubt pressed heavier than pride. He had convinced himself he was restoring fairness. Now he wasn't certain what he had restored. Brian Keller joined him. This complicates things, the young lawyer admitted, adjusting his tie. Ethan nodded but said nothing. Inside chambers, Judge Whitmore reviewed the footage privately. Her earlier ruling had been based strictly on ordinance language and presented evidence, but law without context can distort intent. She replayed the moment where Ethan appeared agitated. Her brows tightened. The memory of her father losing his business resurfaced. How partial complaints had outweighed his years of honest work. She disliked being wrong, but she disliked injustice more. When court reconvened, the atmosphere carried tension of a different kind: anticipation. Judge Whitmore spoke deliberately. Additional evidence has been presented. The court acknowledges that the initial assessment may not have considered full context. Ethan's shoulders tensed. Caleb remained still. Further review is warranted before enforcement proceeds. The words were not yet reversal, but they were no longer finality. Emily exhaled slowly. Truth, once heard clearly, cannot be unheard. The session adjourned for extended review. As people filtered out, Marcus approached Caleb hesitantly. "Does this mean—" "It means patience," Caleb answered gently. Naomi reached for his hand. Across the room, Ethan gathered his belongings without looking up. The certainty he had carried into the courtroom had dissolved into something less solid. The case was no longer one-sided, and the echo of music lingered in a place built for silence. The courtroom filled more quickly the next morning. Word had spread. Chicago winters had a way of sharpening sound, and outside the courthouse the wind cut between buildings like a blade. Inside, however, the atmosphere carried a low electric current of anticipation. Reporters had not arrived in droves, but a few independent bloggers sat near the back, phones poised discreetly. Maple Street performers, painters, a violinist, even a food cart vendor, occupied one entire bench. Caleb Johnson entered quietly, wearing the same charcoal suit as before. His movements were composed, though a sleepless night had traced faint shadows beneath his calm eyes. Naomi walked beside him, her steps measured. She had tied her hair neatly again, but today her shoulders seemed steadier. Marcus followed, taller than before in posture if not in height, his nervous energy replaced by cautious hope. Across the aisle, Ethan Miller sat rigid. His navy blazer looked sharper today, as if pressed with urgency. His jawline was tight, his gray eyes hollow from little sleep. The folder labeled "Evidence" rested unopened beside him. He had replayed Emily's footage repeatedly the night before, trying to find angles that would restore certainty. Instead, he found gaps in his own conviction. Judge Margaret Whitmore entered promptly. There was something different in her bearing. Less rigid, more deliberate. She had spent hours reviewing footage from multiple perspectives, comparing timestamps, cross-referencing city ordinance language. Law, she believed, must be applied carefully, but fairness required context. She adjusted her glasses and began. The court has reviewed additional materials submitted yesterday, including independent recordings from multiple sources. The room stilled. The pattern is clear. Her voice did not rise, but it carried weight. The majority of gatherings surrounding Mr. Johnson's performances are peaceful and voluntary. Instances of congestion appear intermittent and not directly caused by intentional obstruction. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Judge Whitmore continued. Furthermore, certain presented evidence was selectively edited in a manner that omitted relevant context. A murmur rippled through the benches. Brian Keller shifted uncomfortably, his youthful confidence fading into professional caution. "The suspension is lifted," Judge Whitmore declared. "Mr. Johnson is free to continue performing under existing city permit regulations." For a moment, no one breathed. Then Naomi exhaled softly, her hand gripping Caleb's. Marcus's shoulders rose with visible relief. Professor Harper nodded once, dignified but deeply satisfied. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. It was not triumph he felt, but release, a tightening that had gripped his chest since the ruling dissolved slowly, like ice thawing under sunlight. Judge Whitmore was not finished. "Mr. Miller," she said evenly, turning her gaze across the aisle. "While the court acknowledges the right of any citizen to file concerns regarding public safety, the submission of misleading or incomplete material undermines that right." Ethan swallowed. A formal warning will be issued for filing a complaint supported by selectively edited evidence and for conduct contributing to public tension. The word warning echoed loudly in Ethan's ears. Gasps moved through the courtroom again, quieter this time, but unmistakable. Ethan did not look at Caleb. His eyes remained fixed forward, though his composure cracked in subtle ways. For the first time he appeared smaller, not in stature, but in certainty. The gavel struck. Court adjourned. Outside, Chicago waited beneath a pale winter sun. The courthouse steps gleamed faintly from overnight frost. A handful of Maple Street regulars had gathered, unsure what the outcome would be. Among them stood Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s. She was short, with soft silver curls and kind blue eyes magnified behind large glasses. Eleanor had attended Caleb's performances nearly every Saturday since summer. After losing her husband 5 years earlier, she found comfort in the gentle steadiness of his music. She believed deeply in fairness, perhaps because she had once disciplined students too quickly and learned regret from it. When Caleb emerged from the courthouse doors, Eleanor clapped first. The sound was small, but it spread. Applause rose slowly from the gathered crowd. Not loud, not overwhelming, just enough. Naomi stood beside him, her face composed but radiant with relief. Marcus lingered a few steps behind, already imagining the next rehearsal. Emily Carter stood near the base of the steps, tablet tucked under her arm. She did not seek attention. She simply watched as the balance shifted back into place. Her expression carried quiet affirmation rather than pride. Professor Harper approached Caleb, offering a firm handshake. "Truth requires witnesses," he said softly. Across the plaza, Ethan exited alone. No one booed. No one shouted. The city did not punish him publicly. It simply continued. He paused at the edge of the steps, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. For a brief second, he glanced back at the courthouse doors. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between embarrassment and reflection. Brian Keller walked beside him, speaking in low tones about procedure and professional lessons. Ethan nodded without responding. The word warning echoed again in his mind, not as condemnation, but as mirror. Maple Street that evening felt different. The sky turned lavender as dusk approached. Performers returned cautiously at first. A guitarist tuned strings. A painter unfolded an easel. The space seemed to breathe again. Caleb wheeled his midnight blue piano into position beside the subway entrance. He paused before sitting down, taking in the brick towers, the flickering lights, the familiar sidewalk. Marcus stood nearby with his saxophone. Naomi and Lila arrived together, bundled in scarves. Lila waved energetically from the edge of the crowd. Caleb began to play. The first notes carried gratitude. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady. The crowd gathered, careful not to block pathways. Officer Linda Chavez passed by briefly, offering a small approving nod. She observed the spacing with trained eyes and saw cooperation instead of chaos. Across the street, Ethan stood at his usual spot. For the first time in weeks, he did not perform immediately. He watched as Caleb's melody rose into the evening air. Something inside him shifted, not fully healed, not resolved, but altered. The city had spoken. The suspension was lifted. The warning was issued. And Maple Street, under winter lights, felt whole again. Winter settled fully over Chicago, frosting the edges of Maple Street in pale silver. The brick towers seemed quieter now, less imposing, as if the city itself had exhaled after weeks of tension. When Caleb rolled his midnight blue piano back into its familiar spot, applause rose before he even touched the keys. It wasn't louder in volume. It was warmer in tone. People lingered with intention rather than curiosity. He had changed slightly. The court's reversal had not made him proud. It had made him reflective. Caleb played differently now, less guarded, more open. His notes carried a softness shaped by trial and release. There was a new patience in the way he transitioned between chords, as though each phrase allowed space for something unfinished to heal. Naomi noticed it immediately. She stood at the edge of the gathering with Lila, wrapped in a wool coat and thick scarf. Naomi's dark eyes observed everything, always. Years in nursing had trained her to recognize subtle shifts in breathing, posture, mood. She had also learned that survival is not the same as peace. Tonight, Caleb looked peaceful. Lila, bundled in a red knit hat too big for her small head, clapped enthusiastically between songs. She had grown taller in recent months, her confidence blooming alongside her reading skills. After the courtroom ordeal, she had asked one simple question at home. Why did they think Daddy was wrong? Caleb had answered gently, "Sometimes people don't see the whole picture." Lila nodded and returned to her books. Children understand fairness more naturally than adults. Marcus stood nearby, saxophone polished and ready. His posture had shifted since the trial. The uncertainty in his shoulders had been replaced with quiet determination. Professor Harper had helped him draft scholarship applications, guiding him through essays about resilience and art in public spaces. Marcus now practiced not only for sound, but for future opportunity. His tone had deepened, richer, steadier. Maple Street resumed its rhythm, but across the street, something else stirred. Ethan Miller arrived one evening without his folding table. He stood alone at first, hands in his coat pockets, watching the crowd gather around Caleb. His posture was no longer sharp with tension. It was hesitant. His once crisp blazer had been replaced by a simple, dark coat, collar turned up against the cold. His eyes moved differently now, less calculating, more searching. Ethan had not performed since the court warning. Pride had kept him away. Reflection had kept him awake at night. He had replayed everything in his mind, the selective edits, the anger that had grown from comparison. He remembered his father's voice dismissing magic as a hobby. He realized he had mistaken another man's success for his own failure. Bitterness had spoken in his place. As Caleb finished a gentle piece that evening, Ethan stepped forward slowly. The crowd parted slightly, not out of hostility but curiosity. Caleb noticed him immediately. He did not stop playing, but he softened the melody into a quiet background hum. Ethan cleared his throat. His voice, usually sharp and rehearsed, came out lower. "I let bitterness speak for me," he said quietly. The words hung between them. Caleb's hands paused briefly above the keys. He looked at Ethan, not with accusation but with careful attention. His expression held neither triumph nor resentment. He nodded once. "That happens," Caleb replied simply. No lecture, no performance, just acknowledgement. The crowd remained silent, sensing something private unfolding in public. Ethan exhaled, as if releasing weeks of tension. He did not ask for forgiveness theatrically. He did not justify himself. He stepped back, giving space. That evening ended without further drama, but something had shifted. The following week, Maple Street witnessed something unexpected. Ethan returned, not across the street but beside Caleb's block. He unfolded a smaller table closer to the piano, careful to leave walkway space clear. He did not announce himself loudly. Instead, he performed close-up illusions for small clusters, cards appearing between fingers, coins vanishing from palms. Caleb played softly, adjusting tempo to create space between Ethan's moments of reveal. The music did not overpower. It supported. Marcus joined with subtle saxophone harmonies, weaving sound around both performances. The crowd did not divide. It multiplied. Families lingered longer. Children moved between music and magic, eyes wide with curiosity. The energy felt cooperative rather than competitive. Where tension once existed, balance now formed naturally. Officer Linda Chavez observed from a distance again, arms folded loosely. She had seen many public disputes escalate beyond repair. This one had not. She nodded once to herself and continued her patrol. A new face appeared among the gathering one Saturday afternoon. Her name was Sarah Bennett, owner of a small neighborhood cafe 2 blocks away. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and slender with warm, olive-toned skin and expressive dark eyes. Her curly black hair was usually tied back in a loose ponytail. She had built her cafe from scratch after losing her corporate job during an economic downturn. The experience had hardened her financially, but softened her empathy. She believed in second chances. She watched the collaborative performance thoughtfully. Afterward, she approached both men. "You know," she said with a faint smile, "my cafe hosts open mic nights on Thursdays. Music and performance together might draw a different kind of crowd." Her tone was practical, but encouraging. Caleb exchanged a glance with Ethan. Ethan hesitated only a second before nodding. That could work. Sarah handed them her card. The invitation felt less like opportunity and more like affirmation, that the block no longer belonged to rivalry, but to possibility. Even Eleanor Hayes returned, folding her small chair with care before settling near the front. She leaned toward a younger woman beside her and whispered, "See? Fairness works when people allow it." The younger woman nodded, filming with her phone. Maple Street's rhythm stabilized. Caleb's melodies grew lighter in texture. Ethan's tricks became more relaxed, less desperate for applause. Marcus's harmonies matured, his confidence steady. The sidewalk remained clear, as if everyone collectively understood the lesson of recent weeks. One evening, as dusk painted the sky violet, Caleb ended with a piece he had written during the suspension. A quiet, reflective composition layered with subtle tension resolving into calm. Ethan stood beside him, shuffling cards slowly between fingers. Marcus closed with a sustained saxophone note that drifted upward like breath in cold air. Applause rose, not thunderous, but unified. The block felt shared. No longer divided by envy, no longer overshadowed by accusation. Maple Street had not changed physically. The bricks were the same. The wind still cut sharp in winter. But something invisible had shifted. Cooperation had replaced comparison. Ethan packed his cards carefully that night, glancing at Caleb. "Tomorrow?" he asked simply. Caleb smiled faintly. "Tomorrow." The crowd dispersed slowly, carrying warmth into the cold Chicago night. The music and the magic had learned to coexist. And the street, once fractured, now held harmony. Spring arrived quietly in Chicago, softening the hard edges winter had carved into Maple Street. The wind no longer bit at faces. It carried warmth and the scent of blooming trees from nearby planters. Sunlight lingered longer between the red brick buildings, turning the street into a corridor of gold each evening. The block that once felt divided now felt intentional. Months had passed. Maple Street was no longer described as the place with the piano. It had become something broader, something collaborative. Word spread organically through social media, neighborhood blogs, and simple conversation. Visitors arrived not only to hear music or watch magic, but to witness coexistence. Caleb Johnson still positioned his midnight blue piano beside the subway entrance. The golden swirls on its surface gleamed brighter now after a fresh polish Naomi had insisted on one Sunday afternoon. Caleb had grown slightly more confident in his posture. Not proud, but grounded. His playing had matured. It carried both memory and movement, a reminder of where he had stood and how he had chosen to respond. Ethan Miller performed only a few feet away, his illusions no longer competitive but complementary. He had refined his craft in the months since reconciliation, focusing on close-up engagement rather than attention-grabbing gestures. His gray eyes, once sharp with comparison, now held patience. The bitterness that once tightened his movements had eased into something humbler. Marcus Reed stood between them most evenings, saxophone steady against his shoulder. He had received acceptance into a summer music workshop through Professor Harper's recommendation. His sound had gained clarity and depth. Where nervousness once shaped his phrasing, confidence now directed it. He still looked young, tall, slightly lanky, but his presence carried purpose. Emily Carter's documentary premiered online in early April. She had worked tirelessly through winter, editing carefully, layering interviews with live performance footage. The film did not focus on conflict. Instead, it explored public art as shared space, how sidewalks become stages and strangers become audiences. Caleb's music flowed through transitions. Ethan's illusions appeared as symbols of perception shifting. Marcus's saxophone underscored growth. The documentary gained traction quickly, not because of controversy, but because of tone. People were tired of division narratives. They responded to collaboration. Emily, who had always preferred the background to the spotlight, found herself answering interview requests. She remained composed, her freckled face thoughtful under camera lights. The story was never about accusation, she said in one interview. It was about context. At St. Mary's Hospital, Naomi noticed nurses streaming clips during breaks. One colleague, a tall woman named Dr. Priya Shah, an emergency physician in her late 30s with dark braided hair and steady analytical eyes, approached Naomi gently. Priya had immigrated from India at 12 and understood the weight of navigating perception. "Your husband's music," she said softly, "it feels like medicine." Naomi smiled faintly. She understood that compliment deeply. Lila, now nearing 8, experienced her own shift. In her elementary classroom, she stood proudly during show and tell and said, "My dad plays for the city." Her teacher, Mrs. Hollis, a middle-aged woman with kind wrinkles and floral dresses, nodded warmly. Lila's classmates later asked if they could visit Maple Street. Lila beamed. Children, unlike adults, rarely questioned belonging. Judge Margaret Whitmore began walking Maple Street occasionally in the early evenings. She dressed plainly during these visits. Long dark coat, simple flats, hair loosened slightly from its formal bun. She moved without announcement, blending into the small crowds. Her sharp eyes observed spacing, behavior, tone. One evening, she paused at the edge of the performance area. Caleb noticed her but did not alter his rhythm. He played a gentle arrangement that evening, soft chords layered beneath Marcus's melodic phrasing. Ethan performed a small illusion for a group of children nearby, pulling a coin from behind a boy's ear and handing it back with a smile. Judge Whitmore stood still for several minutes. In her career, she had often been required to choose between strict interpretation and contextual understanding. Watching Maple Street now, she felt the quiet satisfaction of having corrected course. Law must protect order, but it must also recognize harmony when it exists. She did not approach Caleb. She did not speak. She simply listened. Sarah Bennett's cafe, 2 blocks away, had become an extension of Maple Street's identity. Thursday, open mic nights filled with musicians and poets. Caleb occasionally played there with Marcus. Ethan performed card illusions between sets. Sarah moved between tables gracefully, balancing trays with practiced ease. Her dark eyes scanned the room constantly, not out of suspicion but out of care. She remembered what it felt like to rebuild from setback, and she cultivated that atmosphere deliberately. Eleanor Hayes continued bringing her folding chair. She now sat closer to Ethan sometimes, marveling at card tricks with childlike delight. Her blue eyes sparkled behind thick lenses. "You're getting better," she told him once. Ethan smiled genuinely. Officer Linda Chavez still patrolled, posture straight, movements efficient. She had grown to appreciate the rhythm of Maple Street. It required no intervention anymore. Performers spaced themselves responsibly. Audiences adjusted naturally. Order existed without enforcement. One Saturday evening, a light rain began unexpectedly. Instead of scattering, the crowd shifted under umbrellas, forming a loose semicircle that left the walkway clear. Caleb's melody softened into something reflective. Marcus's saxophone rose in sustained notes. Ethan performed close-up illusions beneath a street lamp's glow, cards flickering like sparks. The street listened. Not to color, not to pass tension, but to courage expressed quietly through art. As twilight deepened, Caleb felt something settle inside him. Not relief this time, but understanding. The street had never belonged to him. It had never belonged to Ethan. It belonged to those willing to uplift it. He realized that the trial had not tested his talent. It had tested his response. He had chosen steadiness. Ethan had chosen humility. Emily had chosen courage. The community had chosen fairness. Maple Street became known across Chicago not for controversy, but for collaboration. Tour guides mentioned it casually. If you're downtown, they would say, visit the block where music and magic share space. Applause rose that evening as Caleb closed with a gentle crescendo. The sound carried upward, brushing the brick towers that once echoed tension. Now they echoed something else. Unity. Ethan stood beside him, cards tucked neatly away. Marcus lowered his saxophone slowly. Naomi squeezed Lila's hand. Judge Whitmore, standing at the edge of the crowd, nodded once to herself before turning to leave. As music floated into twilight, applause rose, not for color, but for courage. Final lesson. This story reminds us that talent does not need to shout to be powerful. It needs integrity. Caleb did not win because he was louder. He stood firm because he chose dignity over anger. In daily life, we face similar moments. At work, in school, in our neighborhoods, we are sometimes judged quickly, misunderstood, or compared unfairly. The easy reaction is bitterness. The harder path is patience and character. Ethan teaches us something important too. Envy grows quietly when we measure our worth against someone else. Comparison can blind us to our own potential, but humility can restore what pride destroys. It is never too late to admit wrong and choose better. This story also speaks about race and fairness. A street does not belong to one color. A city does not belong to one group. Respect is not selective. When we judge people by appearance instead of action, we shrink the space we all share. When we listen fully before deciding, we create justice in small, everyday ways. In your own life, ask yourself, do I react from fear or from understanding? Do I compete to destroy or to grow? Do I speak up when truth needs a witness? Be the person who brings context before criticism. Be the neighbor who uplifts instead of divides. Be the voice that defends fairness even when it is uncomfortable. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what lesson stood out to you. Subscribe for more stories about courage, accountability, and hope. May God bless you and your family with wisdom, patience, and strength. If you believe in standing for fairness and choosing character over conflict, comment Amen, and let your voice be part of that light.